All right, part two, seventh period. Well, it's just me because it's now a fourth period and I'm all alone. But before I go, I wanted to finish out this lecture for Heart of Darkness, and maybe even because I'm not there to answer your questions in person, give you a little bit more than I've given everybody else. So we left off with this section right here where he's talking about the earth is unearthly, and the men were, no, they were not inhuman. So this is a really important moment for Marlowe because if they're not inhuman, that makes them human. And I know that's not a monumental revelation for many people, but for a person who is part of a quote unquote superior race, this is a monumental moment because he's beginning to realize that the African natives are people, and that is the first step towards understanding the error of his ways. And so he continues by saying, well, that was the worst of it, the suspicion of their not being inhuman. Okay, so how can that be bad, that they're human? Why does that bother Marlowe? There are a lot of reasons for this and a lot of things that you can sort of figure out. But in my own personal opinion, I think it bothers Marlowe because he considered himself, quote unquote, better than that. But if they're human and he's human, then he's as capable of anything they're doing. It's along the same lines of the idea that Hitler was human and you're human, serial killers are human. So if they're capable of such horrible atrocities, that capacity must live within you as well. And it's a little frightening at times to think, oh, I am the same species as that horrible person that did that horrible thing. And so Marlowe is having this moment of awakening almost that he doesn't want. He doesn't want to realize that he and the African natives are the same, that being civilized and being savage are just words and are completely subjective terms. Um, and so he says, um, it would come slowly to one. So it's like an awakening. It's slowly dawning on him. They howled and leaped and spun and made horrid faces, but what thrilled you was just the thought of their humanity like yours, the thought of that remote kinship with this wild and passionate uproar. Okay, so he's using words like thrilled and kinship and passionate. And so despite the fact that he doesn't want to be like the African natives and that's disturbing him a little bit, he also is is sort of happy about being like them because they have a freedom, ironically, that he doesn't really have. He has all these rules and regulations and all these social order rules that he has to abide by, and he doesn't see them having to follow those same rules. Now, that's a little narrow-minded and a little blind because, of course, their culture has their own rules, but he sees a freedom in what they are that sort of sings within him. He understands wanting to leap and howl and dance because we've all wanted to do that from time to time. It's boring being a quote good girl or good boy. He wants to be out there. Now, the irony of the situation is that he is attracted to their freedom, but they are not free. It is their freedom which scares the European invaders and makes them enslave the African natives. So they are free, yet they are not free. And he says, it was ugly. Yes, it was ugly enough, but if you were man enough, you would admit to yourself that there was in you just the faintest trace of a response to that terrible frankness of that noise, a dim suspicion of there being a meaning in it which you so remote from the night of first ages, could comprehend. And so he's already before talked about how he feels like he's going back to a primitive state, a primeval forest, that Eden kind of level, that first age of man thing. And so he sees the natives here as like the very beginning of mankind. And so, yeah, it's a racist thought to say that he is the evolved form of what he sees, but we are dealing with a person who is awakening to an understanding. He is not yet awake. And he says he's this is one of the first times he's going to mention, like, if you are man enough. Sometimes being a man means facing things within yourself you are not proud of. And Marlowe is not proud here with his thoughts or his ideas, because it has been ingrained to him that the African natives are less than he is. That has been written into who he is as a person. It's kind of like if you have a racist family, it's hard for you to overcome that racism. Marlowe is in that situation. He just says and does things that are dumb that he just doesn't really understand, because that's how he has been brought up. And that's how all of his culture has been brought up. So now he's beginning to see them in a much different way. So then we go over here, and this is where one of those on-the-spot questions happens. He is talking here, let the fool gape and shudder, the man knows, and can look on without a wink. So he's talking about what he has just seen, what he's just heard, what he's just thought. So if you are struggling to answer that on-the-spot question 3, hit rewind, go over that section again. But this is an important thing to look at. And you need to know the difference between principles and belief. And belief and faith can sort of be interchangeable here. All right, so he uses the fool statement a few times. There are several people on this boat, so it's kind of hard sometimes to keep track of who is and who isn't there. There are a lot of natives on this boat. And so if we keep going, we're going to keep looking. Oh, here we go. So he's going to begin to talk about being hungry. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the cannibals aren't really cannibals. They might even joke about eating people, but it's just a joke. It's just a joke to mess with the white colonials. And so here he's saying that they are trading for this wire, and he doesn't really understand why. And then he talks about them eating something, but it's so little and so tiny that it doesn't seem like it would feed them. It could be several things. It could be some kind of drug. It probably is mushed up and fermented palm root, or yams of some kind, or some kind of tube vegetable, like not a potato, but like a root vegetable. It's very common for cultures to ferment those because they are high in vitamin C and they last for a long time, because fermenting requires rotting. So if it's already rotten, it's not going to rot. But so that's probably what they're eating. It's a complex carbohydrate, so it's got a lot of slow burn to it. It's got a lot of nutrition in it. But he doesn't think that they are eating enough of it. So he's kind of impressed that they don't attack the men. Since they're cannibals, they're not attacking the men. He's kind of impressed with them. And he mentions they were 30-5. They could have easily taken them over. And they're big, powerful men. But he says, I saw something restraining. One of those human secrets of baffling probability that came into play. And so he's like, well, maybe I began to perceive them in a new light, as it were. Maybe they aren't cannibals. Maybe they aren't bad. Maybe they're not going to eat us. And so he's like, well, I positively hoped that my aspect was not so, what shall I say, so unappetizing, a touch of fantastic vanity. He's like, what? Why won't they eat me? Am I not good enough to eat? So that occurs to him a minute. It's a silly, and he mentions that it's silly. But then he starts to talk about that they must be hungry. And so he looked at them as you would on a human being, which is good, with a curiosity for their impulses, motives, capacities, weaknesses, when brought to the test of an inexorable physical necessity. So he is looking at them now as people and beginning to study them. He wants to understand how they function, how they work. He wants to know more about them. So again, we have Marlowe taking a positive step to understand this new culture he sees and to see them as a culture and as people. And he talks about restraint. No, you don't have restraint when you have hunger. What was it? Superstition, disgust, patient fear, some kind of primitive honor? What is keeping these cannibals, who are obviously hungry, from attacking these men? It can't be restraint. He doesn't know what it is. But he says no fear can stand up to hunger. No patience can wear it out. Disgust simply does not exist where hunger is. So hunger is all powerful. And as to superstition, beliefs, and what you may call principles, they are less than chaff in the breeze. Don't you know the devilry of lingering starvation, its exasperating torment, its black thoughts, its somber and brooding ferocity? Well, I do. So we learn a little something about Marlowe here, that he has been in a terrible situation if he knows the horror of hunger. It takes a man all his inborn strength to fight hunger properly. It's really easier to face bereavement, dishonor, and the perdition of one's soul than this kind of prolonged hunger. Now, if you speak Spanish at all, you can look at this word, and you might be able to recognize a root there. That's right, Louis. It's perder, to be lost. Perdition means to lose. I got through some of my Spanish classes by saying estoy perdida, which means I am lost. It's really cute, it's clever, it's good to have in a clutch when you don't know what to say in AP Spanish. Estoy perdida. So he's saying here that it's really easier to face grief, dishonor, or the loss of your soul than it is to face hunger. In the face of hunger, everyone fails. So if you go back, Count Ugolino, you can't get much worse than eating your children. And he has lost his soul as well. But he's not sad in hell that he lost his soul. He's sad in hell because of what he did. So this is a thing that you need to be thinking about and going back to, that Count Ugolino in the very end of the Inferno. So we're going to keep moving through. It's getting a little dicey for Marlowe as we go through. I did not think they would attack for obvious reasons. There are people on the bank that seem to be, there's a lot of shouting and yelling and drums, and it's getting a little more hostile, and everybody's getting really nervous. But what made the idea of an attack inconceivable to me was the nature of the noise, of the cries we heard. They were not fierce character boding of immediate hostile intention, unexpected, wild, and violent as they had been. They had given me an irresistible impression of sorrow. The glimpse of the steamboat had for some reason filled those savages with unstrained grief. This is important to note. The savages in the African wilderness are not angry. They are overcome with sorrow. They are grieving. There is something going on here beyond what Marlowe can figure out, and he is confused. You would expect people to, if you're invading someone's territory, you would expect anger, but these savages are not angry. And so if you continue on, he's going to talk about the boat. So you get a good description of the boat over here. Then you get a description of the helmsman. The helmsman is one of my favorite characters. I absolutely love the helmsman. He is a precious soul to me. He is described as an athletic black belonging to some coast tribe. So he's not even from around here. He's from the coast. And educated by my poor predecessor. So he has, a little bit of English skills. He's got some vocational skills. He knows what to do. He sported a pair of brass earrings, wore a blue cloth wrapper from the waist to the ankles, and thought all the world of himself. So, he's got a personality. He's not an animal. He's a person with a personality. That's why we call it a personality. He was the most unstable kind of fool I had ever seen. He steered with no end of a swagger while you were by. So while you're there, he's acting all confident. He's like, I got this. I can steer this boat. It's not a big deal. But if he lost sight of you, he became instantly the prey of an abject funk and would let that cripple of a steamboat get the upper hand of him in a minute. So when Marlowe walks away, the helmsman feels like he doesn't know what he's doing. So it's like a facade almost. Like he knows what he's doing. He's got all this swagger, but then in reality, he's nervous. He doesn't really know what he's doing. Marlowe sees this as kind of like a joke or like a cop-out, but I think it's actually true. I think the helmsman wants to do well, but he doesn't know how. All right, I'm running out of time here, so I'm gonna have to wrap this up. But I do want to mention right here the helmsman. The helmsman is super important because the person who has the helm is steering the boat. There's something symbolically significant about the person who steers the boat. You need to think about the implications of having the helmsman steer. Love you, bye.